relationship can feel weird because sometimes you feel like you are not being heard, all right? And it's not just romantic context, also can be in the workplace. Like an employee may feel unheard. The boss may feel misinterpreted. There's always this potential drama happening in every relationship we have. So we're gonna talk today about something that quite honestly, when it pertains to communication, people don't focus on. In fact, our culture doesn't really even think about it that much. I want to today talk about, in communication, the sacred art of listening. The sacred art of listening. And here's the reason why. Because for the most part, we as Americans are terrible listeners. We really are. We like to talk, but we don't like to listen. And Jesus even said, whoever has ears, let him hear. In other words, just because you have these things on the side of your head doesn't mean that you're necessarily using them. And so he's saying, make sure you really hear, make sure you really listen. Listening is vitally important in communication. And it seems like nowadays in our culture, everybody wants to talk. Everybody wants to post. Everybody wants to spout off. Everybody wants to share their opinion, all right? Hardly anyone wants to listen. Hardly anyone wants to listen. In fact, it seems like everything around us in our culture intrudes on our ability to listen well. Like we have a culture, all of us, we're inundated by social media, by a lot of things happening around us, coming at us online, in life, through the news, whatever. It's always coming at us. Life is coming at us all the time. And so rare is that precious gift of listening. In fact, it seems like in our culture, we communicate, but we really don't connect. We talk at each other, but we don't connect with each other. And I want to talk about this today, and I'm just gonna be honest for a moment. This is not gonna be like this sensational, thrilling topic we're gonna talk about today. Like it's not gonna be something that you're gonna want to amen a lot, because a lot of this is maybe new material or something that you haven't thought of before, but I'm telling you, it's vitally important. If you will take what I'm talking about today and apply it even in the most minute sense in your relationships, you will see those relationships rise, all right? Think about this. When you went to high school, or maybe you went to college, you probably had a speech class, right? Some of you were horrified by speech class. How many of you introverts are in the house, right? You're like, oh gosh, I had to give a speech. You take speech classes, maybe even you go into public speaking, maybe there's classes on that. How many of you can recall any class in high school or in college on becoming a better listener? No. You know why? It's because we really don't have those kind of classes. In fact, our culture, to a degree, doesn't even value listening. It almost feels like listening is lesser than talking. And so why would we want to study listening? We need to study giving better speeches and communicating better with our words. But if you want to have a great marriage, and if you want to have a great business, and if you want to have a great sales presentation even, you need to learn how to be a great listener first. Because listening is not just a skill that you have, that you use your ears, but it uses a concentration of all your senses. You hear, but you also are watching. You're looking at people's demeanor. You're trying to listen to their tone, and you're trying to discern, what are they feeling? What are they needing? What are they trying to communicate to me? It is an active thing. It is not a passive thing. Now, many of you probably have heard these stats before, but here's a study. A study went and said in communication, 55% of communication is nonverbal. In other words, it isn't your words, it's the body language of the person, the facial expression, how they're leaning in or they're doing this. It is nonverbal. 38% of communication is voice tone. The tone of voice, in other words, the change in pitch. And when you're talking to somebody, you can see a change or hear a change in pitch. That's 38%. Only 7% of the effectiveness of your communication are your words. Only 7%. Now, words are important. Don't hear me saying words are not important. They're important, but they are the least effective in your communication tool belt when you're talking to somebody. The nonverbal and the voice tone have way more impact than even the words have, not only when you're talking to somebody, when they're talking to you, which means that the words we speak have the least amount. And so what do we do now in our society? We mostly communicate via text and email. I mean, that's become kind of our MO, that even people having very important conversations, it's via text or email. And I get it, sometimes you have to have an email to keep a record and all that kind of stuff in business. But my point is that we have relegated our most important conversations to maybe some words on a screen or something. But here's the challenge. You can't see the other person's body language or hear their voice tone through a text. You can't do it. So what do we do to compensate that? Because we're texting, we're doing it for years, and we're not real sure if we can interpret the text, so emojis were invented. And what's an emoji? Now, many of us are like, oh, that's cool. Well, I think there's a psychology behind it. An emoji was invented, or heart eyes, or whatever that you use, because you're trying to take your words and add a signal of emotion into it for the reader. Does that make sense? Like, how many of you know a serial exclamation point texter? Like, they use exclamation points like crazy in their text messages. I can tend to be one of these. I mean, I could be like, hi, exclamation point. Where are you, exclamation point, kind of a thing. And is Jeremy yelling at me? Is he just excited, right? Like here, this text message. What are you doing here, okay? Look at this text message. What are you doing here? With this text message, this could be interpreted many different ways. This could be, what are you doing here? Or it could be, what are you doing here, right? See, words alone are only part of our communication. And when we have made our primary communication just text message or email or electronic, then guess what? We have significantly diminished our effectiveness in communication. We really have. This is one of the reasons why I think it's very interesting. Sociologists will tell you that since text messaging and email, there has been a lessening of effective communication because people don't do it the old-fashioned way that we've done it for millennia, and that is they look at each other in the eye and they have a conversation. Rather, it's a quick text or whatever else. Now again, I'm not anti-text, I'm not anti-technology, all right? But my point is that cannot be your primary way of communicating if you wanna level up in your communication. Exodus 24, it's a story of God, and he's reaching out to Moses, and he goes, hey, listen, I have some things that I want to communicate to you. I want you to meet me on the mountain, and he's gonna communicate something very important. He's gonna give Moses a set of commandments on tablets, and these commandments are gonna be instructions to God's people on how to live in a healthy way, how to live with purpose, how to live in right standing with God, how to live in the way that we were created to live. And so this is what God says to Moses in Exodus 24:12. It says, then the Lord said to Moses, come up to me on the mountain and be there. Turn to the person next to you and say, be there. And I will give you the tablets of stone. No, wait a minute. God said, that is unnecessary to say. If you go back and read this, all he had to say was, the Lord said to Moses, come up to me on the mountain, and I will give you tablets of stone and the laws and the commandments which I've written, that you may teach them. That could have been easy. That could have sufficed, right? But what does God say instead? Says, no, I want you to come up on the mountain and I want you to be there. Now, why? Because he created us and he knows you can be there, but you're not really there, right? I mean, some of you go to meetings. Some of you go to places, like you go to the family gathering or what. You're there, physically you're there, but you're not there. In fact, some of you might even came to church today and you're here, but you're not there, right? We have the ability to do that. And God was saying to Moses, I need you to be all the way there. all the way there. You know, how many of you love it when you're talking to somebody and they're like this? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, that's cool. Man, that's awesome. I mean, how many of you, it's like, wait a minute, I need you to be all the way there. So one of the reasons why growing up with our kids, we had a rule at the dinner table, they couldn't have their devices. And man, I'm telling you, they fought us tooth and nail. Like, I mean, it was like, why can't we? Why? I mean, and I'm like, no, we are not going to be distracted people because we in America many times are distracted people. So the first thing we need to do to be able to up our game on communication in our relationships is to eliminate the barriers to listening. We have to eliminate these barriers. One of the barriers, this is just one of them, but we need to eliminate the barriers so that we can really communicate. And I wrote down only 4 barriers. There's all kinds of them, but these seem to be kind of the granddaddies of our culture. All right, the first one is noise. There's a lot of noise in our society. Noise, people trying to get our attention, advertising, entertainment, social media, TV, different things are always trying to get our attention. It is so hard sometimes to talk. Have you ever been in a restaurant that literally they have the volume of the music so high that you can't even talk to somebody, right? They're creating an environment of noise. Noise can be a barrier. Second thing is this, preoccupation. That's another barrier. You got to try to eliminate that. That's when you have personal weight and concerns and worries or thoughts that you're thinking. And sometimes it's hard to communicate when you're weighed down on the inside by all of these personal things. I know it's hard to do, but if you want to up your game on communication, you got to put those things that preoccupy you aside just for that time while you're trying to connect with that person. Here's another barrier, differences. In other words, we see the world very differently, especially, and I'm just gonna talk to married people for a moment or dating people for a moment. A lot of times you see the world very differently than your significant other. I know I do from Jen does from me. It doesn't mean I'm right and she's wrong or she's right and I'm wrong, but rather we can be in the same room, same environment, even have the same conversation, and she sees it very differently than I do. You know, so sometimes differences can create barriers. Here's the last one that I wrote down, and I'm telling you this one is a biggie in America, and I'm gonna tell you it's gonna get worse in the next months ahead, all right? And that is this, the barrier of close-mindedness. This is where people say, I have an attitude or an unwillingness that I refuse to consider an alternative viewpoint. And we have, I don't know if you know this or not, but we have an election coming this year. I know no one knew that, right? No one knew that. And I will tell you that it feels like America is so polarized and close-minded based upon an aisle with 2 different thoughts on each side of it. And it's gonna get worse. It really will. Politics, biases, all of those kind of things can create a closed-mindedness, and it cuts off communication. Communication ceases when you disagree with that other person and you make it an act of war, if you could say that. In my dissertation, part of my dissertation research, I wanted to interview some Gen Z, which is the youngest generation. I wanted to interview the older portion of them, those that had graduated from high school. So 18 to like 24 at the time was the ceiling of what was considered Gen Z. So between 18 and 25, I gathered a bunch of them together in focus groups, and we went to a neutral location, didn't bring them to the church here, but I wanted to ask them questions about faith, about Christianity, about church, about organized religion. I wanted to see what their belief systems were, okay? So we went to a neutral location. I got up in the meeting. I said, hey, listen, I want you to know my name is Pastor Jeremy DeWeerdt. I run a church called City First Church. You may have heard of it, maybe not. Thank you for being here today. I want you to be honest with your answers to the questions that we have for you. I also don't want you to over-exaggerate. I just want you to answer them accurately according to what you believe. And they all nodded at me. And then I handed off the meeting to younger people than me because I didn't want to be the pastor and the old guy even asking the questions. I felt like somehow that would taint the research. So I actually had people their age ask them questions. And they had a conversation about various topics for the next hour. And I will tell you, I sat in the corner with a pad of paper and was taking copious notes. And it was really hard for me because some of the things that they were saying were very harsh towards what I do. And I will tell you, there were moments that I wanted to kind of go, hey, can I just interject here a minute and give a little perspective? Or I wanted to be like, hey, you know what? You said this, but how about this? I wanted to challenge, so I wanted to get defensive. I wanted to do all the things that humans do, right? When you're talking to somebody that disagrees. And I didn't, because that would have literally ruined the focus group and I would have had to throw out the research. At the end of it, in an hour, I paid them all $100 because that was the deal. I was like, give me an hour, answer questions, I'll give you $100. And so they were starting to walk out the door and I was sitting at the table and I was kind of, collating my thoughts. And three of them, two girls and a guy, walked up and they said, hey, pastor, father, dude, They said, can we ask you some questions? I'm like, sure, sit down. And we had the most amazing, beautiful conversation as they asked questions to me on my thoughts about everything from God to the Bible to values to sexuality to Jesus to cultural norms to all the things. We had this amazing conversation. I could tell they didn't want to leave yet. They actually stayed back and talked to the old pastor guy. And they wanted to talk, and we talked, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. We loved our time together. For 45 minutes, we didn't just communicate, but we connected. Now listen, City First, I want you to realize, I tell you a story for this reason. I am convinced that the reason why those students, why those young people, why those young adults wanted to stay back and talk with me, they'd already received their $100. They could have walked out the door. The reason why is because I was willing to listen first. And when we are individuals who are willing to ask questions and listen first, it opens up communication channels even between people who do not agree with one another. There's a Turkish proverb that says to speak is to sow and to listen is to reap. To build a healthy relationship, we need to listen with the goal of understanding, not the goal of replying, and maybe let me even add arguing. See, in America and in our culture, we listen and try to understand with the goal of many times arguing or replying. Our brains think quicker than people talk. So as they're talking, we're already thinking of what we're gonna say next. And you have to constantly say, no, I'm gonna focus on the words and the body language and the tone in which this person is communicating to me. And here's the problem in many marriages and the problem in many business relationships and even best friend relationships is that we come into conversations in defensive positions and we are trying to communicate why we're right. That's how we go. We're like, well, let me tell you what I think and why I'm right, rather than coming into those conversations and saying, I want to better understand how you think and what you feel. You see, I'm usually the kind of person that wants to give answers or fix things or to give what I believe is true as the answer, but really listening is meaning that you understand the other person. Here's a word picture for you. To understand somebody means you gotta stand under their thoughts. You need to receive them. Now, before any of you freak out on this, listening to understand does not mean you have to agree. That's huge. Just because you're trying to understand that person, you're trying to understand what your spouse is saying. You're trying to understand what your business associate is saying. You're trying to understand what, the salesman or the customer or whatever, whoever it is saying, doesn't mean you have to agree with them. You don't have to wholesale go, yeah, I agree with you. That's not what it's saying. You're just trying to understand them. Does that make sense? And you go, well, I don't know if I can do that. Well, God does it with you. God listens to your prayers, and trust me, he doesn't agree with everything you believe. Or me. Romans 5:8 says this, but God shows his great love for us by sending Christ to die for us while we were still sinners. In other words, while we were his enemies, he loved us and he sent his son to die for us, which means God models for us it is okay to have communication and to attempt relationship even with someone you don't agree with. You see, this, I think, is what's gonna separate Christians in the coming days, months, years ahead from just everyone else in culture, is that we will have the ability to listen to someone and not necessarily agree with them, but love them anyway. No one, generally speaking, is doing that in our culture. This is huge. When I say Christians, I mean real Christians. I mean like not people who just say they're Christians. Like sometimes I look at people and I'm like, change your conduct or change your name. Because I'm talking real Christians, people who want to be Jesus followers, people who are trying very hard to model the way of Jesus in their everyday life. Guess what? You can listen to somebody, ask questions, listen to what they believe, even if you don't agree with them, and you can still love them with a Christ-like love. It seems like everybody in our culture nowadays, you know what they're doing? Everyone in our culture nowadays is going, listen to me, I am right. If you don't agree, you're a terrible person. That's the tone of our nation. There's a book out that I highly suggest that you read. It's not a Christian book. It's written by a gal by the name of Kate Murphy, and it's called You're Not Listening, What You're Missing, and Why It Matters, all right? And she said this in the opening of her book, I think it's page 9 if you wanna know, says this, people get lonely for a lack of listening. Okay, stop there a moment. Do you know that loneliness can increase in your life if you're not a listener? Let that sink in. Psychology and sociology researchers have begun warning of an epidemic literally of loneliness in the United States. And it's happening. The more we're connected on social media, the more lonely we feel because we're just talking at each other. We're not listening. We're just putting words on electronic devices. Experts are calling it a public health crisis as feeling isolated and disconnected increases the risk of premature death as much as obesity and alcoholism combined. Let that last line sink in on you. Because here's the thing, our lack of listening is actually impacting our physical bodies. It's creating loneliness, it's creating stress, it's creating all kinds of things. Listening is not only good for the person that you're talking to or is talking to you, but also listening is good for your personal health, believe it or not. Many times we find ourselves like in an echo chamber. We're just listening to the chatter in the echo chamber of the people that we already agree with. But Jesus modeled something totally different. He showed attentiveness by asking questions. And I want to end with this thought, asking questions, just like Jesus did. Do you know that revolutions begin with a question? Revolutions begin with a question. I remember back many moons ago, Connor, our middle son, he was in middle school, and he was playing basketball. And if you look at the way that the DeWeerts are physically made up, we are not made to play basketball, okay? We really aren't. Soccer maybe, but basketball no, okay? And so anyway, he was playing basketball and his team was awful. Like they did not win. I don't even know if they won a game all season. And after every game, Connor would come out to the car and he was just mad and he would be like, I hate this, I'm gonna quit, this is so stupid. And I did what every type A leader, Enneagram 8 personality dad does, and that is I began to preach at him and say, you can't quit, you made a commitment, the world is full of quitters, and you don't wanna become one of them. You quit enough, and you'll form a habit of quitting. It will be a habit instead of winning. DeWeerts don't quit. And he would look back at me and be like, I don't care. How many of you know that just always telling somebody what to do doesn't work all the time? Now, I'll tell you, as a parent, I would still tell him, and if I had to go back in time, I would still be like, yeah, you're not gonna quit. I would help draw that line with him, but I think I would go about it much different than what I did. Because those years, I kind of just talked at him about this subject rather than really asking questions, trying to unearth what's really going on the inside. Now, you know what was really probably going on the inside? Is that he was tired of feeling like a loser. And you know, that's legitimate. I don't think any of us like feeling like losers. And instead of asking questions and listening, I just preached. I just preached at him, because that's what I do. And here, many years later, I've tried to become better at that, and I've learned that Jesus was an expert at asking questions. Even when he was asked a question, he usually returned it with a question. Do you know, out of all the questions that he asked, and there's over 350 questions that he asked in the New Testament that we have record of, okay? 80 of them were how and why questions. They started off with how or why. And as we close today, I want to encourage you to ask how and why questions in your marriage, to your friends, in the environments in which you have relationships, whether it be school or work or neighborhoods or whatever, how and why questions, and then listen to the answers, even if you don't agree with them, because you will unearth what's really going on in that person's heart. How does that make you feel, Connor? Or you might ask your neighbor, why does that scare you? You might ask your coworker, how can I help? Why does that excite you so much? How long have you been thinking about that and wrestling with it? Why does that matter to you so much? Give me some insight. You see, you start asking questions like that, and all of a sudden the person is gonna start sharing with you what's really going on beyond their words. They're gonna share with you what's really going on in their mind and their heart. Questions can literally save a life. In fact, this is a picture of a place called The Gap, which is outside of Sydney, Australia. It's a tourist site. It's a natural kind of like formation of cliffs that is pretty amazing, and people by the thousands go there every single year to check it out. And many people go for many reasons, but unfortunately, they also go for other more tragic reasons. They many times will go there to take their own life. This is a picture of Don Ritchie. Don Ritchie had a house for 45 years right across the street from the cliff. And for 45 years, he would watch if people were climbing over the safety barrier and starting to head out to the cliff, contemplating ending it all. He had binoculars and he would look. And if he saw somebody, he would go walking down the path and go over to where they were at by the cliff, and he would very carefully and gently walk up to them and ask them a question. He would say, why don't you come and have a cup of tea? Why don't you come and have a cup of tea? Person by person would turn around and take him up in the offer, and they would walk down the sidewalk and cross the street, and they would go to his house and sit in his kitchen, and Don would just spend time asking questions. Tell me what's going on. What are you fearing right now? What's happened in your life? 45 years Don did this. And the records show that he was able to help save 160 people's lives through just asking questions. 160 people. Now, he died in 2012, and he had communicated some things with his family, and his family members go on the record and say it was more than 160. It was probably closer to 500 people Don believes that he saved before he passed away, because most people didn't want to go on the record of admitting that they were even contemplating that. He was called the angel of the gap. And all he did was save people's lives by asking questions and listening. You might be able to save your marriage by asking questions and listening. Save that business relationship by asking questions and listening. Save that best friend relationship by asking questions and really listening, getting rid of the distractions, putting them away, soul to soul, heart to heart, communicating, and really connecting.